Okay, great. So how many people are there just now, actually? Just so I've got an idea, or are they
we can show you. You can see them.
They're on screen. Oh, we're all there in person.
This is your audience.
Make noise, make noise.
How are you doing? Hola a todos.
Tight COVID audience, but we have many more in YouTube.
Yeah.
Excellent, excellent. Okay. So thanks very much for inviting me. What I wanted to, I'm not sure whether or not you are aware of the organization that I work for, the Conservation Planning Specialist Group, which is one of the specialist groups of the Species Survival Commission, which is one of the commissions of the IUCN. And I'm not sure whether you are familiar with our approach to species conservation planning and some relatively recent work that we've published to guide others in what we see as effective, what seems to be effective species conservation planning processes. And so I'm taking this opportunity to share with you not really the practical steps, because they will vary depending on the context, but to share with you the underlying values that should be the foundation of any planning process that you use, as far as we are concerned and from our experience. It's obviously not the only way of doing it, it's not the only way of thinking about planning, but we believe, and we've got pretty good evidence for it now, that these principles seem to contribute to more effective plans being produced, i.e. plans that go on to be implemented effectively and have a positive impact on threatened species. And if you're more interested in areas rather than individual species, then I'd be interested to hear afterwards your thoughts on the relevance of these principles to conserving spaces as well as individual species, because I believe that they probably apply pretty well, but we can maybe pick that up in discussion. So just to introduce the group, CPSG actually started off as the captive breeding specialist group and then became the conservation breeding specialist group, and in 2017 with the mandate of the current chair of the Species Survival Commission to lead or to provide guidance for the wider commission on species conservation planning. CPSG changed to CPSG, the Conservation Planning Specialist Group. Now, throughout the 40 years of our existence, we have been working on and designing and applying collaborative conservation planning processes that bring together disparate groups, different stakeholders that may see the world differently, to develop shared plans for species that they care about. And we, over that time, we've run many hundreds of workshops that have been influential in the conservation work for a whole variety of species in a whole variety of countries. So I think these principles generally apply whatever context that you are working in. Now, it would be easier, and particularly if I had a look at the website linked to this group before, and there's obviously some very clever, knowledgeable, active, dynamic scientists that are involved in this group. And I think there's still a bit of a tendency for those people who care about something, whether it's a species or something else, to say, well, we want to do something, let's get together ourselves and just work out how it should happen. So getting a group of experts together who then develop a plan that says this is what is needed to recover this particular species or this species group or this area. That I think can produce a useful document, an overview of what is known or what we think we know, a sort of knowledge review, a status assessment. But often lacks sufficient buy-in from other groups that have power and also have an interest in the species, to be able to turn that written word into practice on the ground. And so we believe very strongly that in order for this to happen, you need to bring people together. And they may see the world differently, and they may argue with each other. They may challenge each other over the information. They may challenge each other over how they feel that we should respond to the situation. But that interaction and the trust that is built, the understanding that is built as a consequence of the interaction is critical to the development of a plan that then people feel that they own it enough, they believe in it enough, that they will then put it into practice. And we're often working, and you will be in this space as well, in complexity, where we are, if we look along the bottom axis, if you replace technology to what we know about the system, we often find that we are far from certainty. Some people at a species level, some people may be confident that there are hundreds of individuals. Others may feel actually it's in the tens. Some may feel that it's distributed over a much wider area than others feel. What is known about its biology, its ecology, how it interacts with threats. There's going to be a lot of uncertainty there, different perspectives on what is the truth. And then if you go up the side axis as well, there will be a diversity of views around what we do about it. Do we agree on the information? Do we agree on courses of action? Chances are there will be different opinions as to what is the right thing to do. So if we kind of triangulate, or not triangulate, because that requires three, but if we kind of come to it, if you imagine those lines coming together from far from agreement, from far from certainty, we end up in this complex space. And arguably at the moment with COVID and impacts on the wider sort of societal systems, we may be in this anarchic phase. We don't know what's going to happen next. What we are confident is that we are not dealing with simple systems. Okay, there is no, there's rarely a clearly defined truth or a single right way to do something. In fact, all of our decisions, no matter how scientifically robust we feel they are fundamentally based on our values, what we care about, what we believe in. And so rather than trying to ignore that sort of softer side, the more personal side, the emotional side, we need to recognize that those different perspectives, bring them out into the open, discuss them, find areas of commonality, find areas of agreement, and identify how we can move forward together. Because if we don't, if we just move forward with a subset of views, then you may produce a plan that is well thought through, but it is unlikely that you will have had enough buy-in from others that they feel committed to putting it into practice. And if people don't feel part of it, they don't feel they own it, then it drops down the priority list. And so we find yet again another plan that sits on a shelf and doesn't get implemented. Now, we have good evidence that this approach, this more collaborative approach, works. A recent publication by my colleague Caroline Lees and others this year, you can get this still. I can put it in the link afterwards to the paper. Looked at 30 to 40 case studies of species where we have developed a collaborative planning process for, and then she has tracked the trajectory of the species after that workshop to say where was it going to go according to the IUCN red listing, and where is it actually at now. And what we find is if we track before 5 years before where the species, the planning work happened, to 15 years afterwards, that there's a pattern emerging of these workshops, these collaborative workshops, being a pivot point, a point at which the species seem to diverge from that downward trajectory and begin to start stabilizing. And after 10 years or so, start to recover. Now, it's clearly not the plan that's making the recovery happen. It is the people that are doing the work on the ground. But we've looked at other confounding variables, and we could be pretty confident that it was the planning workshop and the catalyst that it provided that resulted in people doing better work together that contributed to the recovery of those species. So these processes work. And these processes are based on 7 foundational principles. You can think of them as the sort of roots of a tree, and we're going to look at those in a little bit more depth just now. Above the ground are what we call planning steps. And these are some of the practical steps you might take to actually put the principles into practice, going from preparing to plan through to learning and improving at the end of the process. I'm not going to focus on the steps, the bit above the line just now. We're going to look at the principles. What roots these processes? What do we see as central to their efficacy? So let's take a look at each of these 7 principles in turn, from plan to act through to adapt to changing circumstances. And then at the end, what we'll do is we'll open it up for questions, see whether or not you feel this resonates with your experience, or whether you have any questions about what is presented. So plan to act may seem like a blatantly obvious statement to make. You're designing a plan in order to see some change on the ground. We feel it is important to keep that front and center in your mind, because it means that there is no one way to do planning for threatened species. You need to think about where is it that people want to get to, what is it they need to do the work they want to with the species, and then from that point, work out how do we help them to get there? How do we plot the journey that they will then take? So every planning process will be tailored to suit the needs of the species, the needs of the group, in order to be most likely that the plan that is produced ends up being put into practice. And an illustration of this in terms of changing processes was some work we did earlier on this year I was involved in with leatherback turtles. And what became clear was that the group, they didn't need to make a plan for the species. They were trying to make a decision over whether or not ex situ management should, at the moment, form part of its recovery efforts. And so the process was tailored to suit that particular decision that they wanted to make. And we also had to do it online as opposed to in person. So we had to make other modifications to be most likely that it produces a decision that they will then go on and use. The second principle is promote inclusive participation. Whatever planning work you're doing, you need to think about who are the people who could have an impact on the project, who could be impacted by the project, and think about how you then include those people, not just them physically, but also ensuring that their voices are heard and valued within the process, so that they feel as if they have actually been listened to, that they have been able to influence the plan that comes out. And an illustration of this is in Argentina and Brazil from, again, earlier this year with sand tiger sharks. And as well as, again, it had to be online because of COVID, there were groups of fishers that clearly were a key stakeholder group to involve, but there was a sense that they wouldn't engage well with the online environment. They weren't going to sit on Zoom like we are now and be willing to share their thoughts and ideas. And so other means were developed to solicit, to gather information from those people. So there were online surveys that were produced. It was a very visual survey that they could look at on their mobile phones. We asked them to do videos on their phones as well, talking about what they care about, what they need, what their interests are. And then there were also some semi-structured interviews that were done with people meeting them in person. Now, that wasn't ideal. Really, ideally, they'd all be involved in the workshop. But because we recognized that they would not feel comfortable participating in that workshop setting, we had to go to them to try and gather their thoughts and views to include within the process. The third principle is use sound science. So basing decisions on the best available information. And that might be well-informed assumptions. It may be experience. It doesn't have to be scientifically collected data, but it is the best available information that you have got. And we often will use population viability analysis modeling, as was done here with the Tamarau, a forest buffalo in the Philippines 18 months ago, no, it was 2 years ago now, where the PVA tool Vortex was used to model the trajectory of the species based on the best available information from all stakeholders, where it was going to if nothing happened, and what the likely impact of different interventions would be to help the groups to settle on the most appropriate strategies. And in fact, the results of this PVA analysis were presented in the final section of the workshop, and a minister was there, was very struck by the graph that came out of this sort of catastrophic decline if nothing happened, and she committed there and then to support the plan for the species and to ensure that it was put into practice. So using best available information, there's a period of time that needs to be used to gather what's available on paper or online, and then obviously utilizing what's in people's heads within the workshop process to base the decisions on. And the fourth principle kind of brings together those first three, where we see a critical step in designing the process itself, not just the content of the discussions, but thinking about how long do people need to be together for, what are the steps they're going to go through to help them to make the decisions they need to solve the problems they need to, etc. What tools might be used, what are the interpersonal skills that are required to enable them to develop the most effective plan. And one challenging aspect of this is to ensure neutral facilitation, that the people who are helping to run the process should be removed enough from the process that they do not require or feel strongly about a particular outcome beyond producing an effective plan, but they don't feel that the species has got to be reintroduced, or we need to do some sort of ex situ management or some other, it's got to be community, we've got to do community livelihoods development work. If you feel sort of strongly that you have something to contribute to the content, then you should be a participant, not a facilitator. The facilitator needs to be able to remain neutral so that the stakeholders can feel trust in the process and therefore believe in the plan that comes out the other end. Reaching decisions through consensus is central. So there are going to be periods of time within any planning process where people are diverging and generating ideas, generating information. And then there will be points in the process where they need to agree. What's the most important information? What are we going to do about it? What are our goals? What are the actions? And at these decision points, that's where you need to really think carefully about how you use thinking tools to help groups to develop consensus. This was critical in recovery work. It was something I was involved in 2 years back with wildcats in Scotland, where they had done an external review of the project and were having to think about to what extent do we use the recommendations from this report to inform our remaining strategy. And so it actually involved the group deciding to move down from working in 7 sites to working in 1 site. And that was quite a big shift, but it actually was very liberating for those people involved, because it meant that all researchers, they weren't spreading themselves thin, trying to do a little bit in all these different areas. They could focus their limited resources on one particular area. But that took a process of consensus building to help them to agree, yes, this is what we need to do going forward. The sixth principle is around generating and sharing products quickly. So getting the results of any planning process out, not just to stakeholders, but to other people who you may not realize, but could be influential in the implementation side. So an illustration of this was actually the last time I got on a plane, which was from March 2020, when we were in the Azores doing work to develop a recovery plan for 40 or so species of snail on one of the islands there. And we shared the draft results of the process, the workshop, the day after the workshop. And it just happened to coincide with a member of government, a regional government, doing a tour of the islands and wanting to have good things to talk about. And he picked up this story and then publicly announced on radio that he was going to support the project, that they would go for EU funding for the project, which they actually did, and they managed to secure EU life funding for this bunch of snails, which often is not going to be high on anyone's priority list. But that just took very quickly getting the information out, even though it wasn't polished, it wasn't finished. But it was ensuring that it was distributed, because you do not know how that information could be picked up and then used that would be a benefit to the things you care about. And lastly, adapting to changing circumstances. So in the same way as the plan itself should not be written in stone, it should be open to a review and evaluation as new information comes on board. So too should the planning process. So for Moroccan raptors that I'm involved in just now, we had a process we had one workshop in person. We then had to shift to online. That didn't seem to work terribly well, and we didn't really get the engagement that we needed. So we're now shifting back to an in-person workshop in January, where hopefully the plan will then be produced. So adapting to the circumstances to try and make sure you keep your eye on the prize, which is to develop a plan that is most likely to be implemented. So these 7 principles underpin all of the work that we do. We feel that they're important foundations for any planning work that should be applied, particularly to species. They're not saying what you should do, they're saying what you should be thinking about as you design the planning process. How are we making sure we're planning to act? Are we being inclusive in the participation? How are we ensuring that the best available information is used? These sorts of, if you turn these principles into questions, then they can be quite a helpful guide. And these principles are sort of infused or are embedded within a whole variety of guidelines produced through the IUCN, whether it's to do with ex situ management, disease risk analysis, or facilitation of these, excuse me, of these processes. And you can get the document on the principles and steps to planning. You can get it from the IUCN website or direct from www.cpsg.org. Excuse me 1 second. These principles also are embedded in the different tools and processes that we've developed that can be useful to groups such as yours, whether it's to do with working with government and saying what we can do for them. The assess to plan process is one in which we working out how do we help groups take very speciose groups of species and work out how to plan for them in subgroups. So are there some species that all have similar threats and therefore could be planned for as a group, or are there some species that require similar interventions and so could be planned for as a group? So this assess to plan process is a participative one that helps people move from kind of red listing through to planning and most effectively. It's population viability analysis tools we talked about, wildlife disease simulation models, and assessments for those people working ex situ in captivity. We also provide a variety of support for people wanting to get involved in improve their abilities in conservation planning, whether it's training, mentoring, etc., on these participative collaborative planning processes. And this all kind of sits within this framework of hopefully the world, or the governments of the world, coming together and developing a particular statement, a much clearer goal linked to species and their recovery. And so all of this work is geared towards supporting groups and individuals who care for species to be able to work out how do we make sure that we do reduce extinction risk, and we do increase the abundance of certain species, of threatened species, by a period of time. Okay, so that really is the, I've sort of come to an end there on those principles of planning, and so it's over to you to say, well, whether or not you have any questions or comments you'd like to make linked to what I've presented.
Okay. Thank you, Jamie.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so is there any question?
I have a burning one just
okay,
to start. So, like in all your experience, and clearly you have been thinking a lot about all of this process. What's the error you keep on seeing over and over in conservation projects? The one that you see most often?
I think we're still at an early stage in our much earlier than the development sector, in recognizing the need to think about the thinking. So to actually think carefully about how we get people to reach agreement. What I think we do too much in conservation is say, we like working with that person, we don't like working with that person doesn't agree with me anyway, so I'm going to go ahead and do my thing. And so we almost celebrate individuality. You know, these charismatic, often people who sometimes do incredible things, but I think we currently in the conservation sector have only examples of good work. We don't have the answer because we're working at such a small scale, and I think that's partly because we still are uncomfortable with collaboration. And working with people who may think very differently to us, but will be central to the success of the thing that we care about. And it's not just a question of giving time to it. We do need to, there's also a recognition that this is a discipline in itself. And I think it should be, all conservation biology courses should have a component of facilitation skills development, because that's what we have to do in conservation, but we don't. All of the courses are, or not all of the courses, most of the courses I've seen are still linked to ecology, biology, which all is good, it's great, genetics, etc., but is insufficient when we come to the practice of conservation.
Yeah. There are so many nodes to connect. It's so difficult. Which ones are the basis? And then you have to go also through the information, but also how to talk to people. It's a monster project in itself. Yep. Okay, I'm going to open to the rest of the room. Okay. You can go ahead, Katerina. Yeah, we were thinking that it would be nice to add a general view for the presenter. It's so difficult, I imagine, to give a talk to a blank screen.
Yeah, it's nice to see people.
COVID times are tough. Perfect. Very good. We are getting better and better.
Okay, so is there any question?
Okay, I will have the first question. I want to ask how you work like a group in the way that you, for example, have a web page where is a lot of things like library, you organize webinars for people, but if, for example, some small organization want to really some detailed advice or want to cooperate with you in some projects, and if you have a lot of experienced people and experts, so how is it? Everybody can call you or write you and you help, or?
We get, so much of our time is taken up with people who approach us and say, we've got this species or this species group that we're concerned about. Could you help us design, you know, help us plan what we do? And so we, you know, we're working with 50 or so projects a year, helping them to design plans for their species, where we often will come in to be the facilitator and the process designer. But increasingly, and this is my main area, we are training and mentoring others so that they can do it for themselves. And so we can support by helping to design and facilitate planning processes, but you can also contact us and say, interested in training in this area, you know, what have you got available? We do have an online course in facilitating species conservation planning workshops, which it is a selected course, and we do give priority to people who are likely to use the skills to design plans for threatened species. But it is a free course that's available. In fact, today I was just sorting out dates for the next one. So it'll probably be around the 7th of March next year. And you can apply, you can go to the CPSG website. You can actually sign up at the website for the e-news that will then tell you when different resources are coming out, whether it's training, guidelines, or planning clinics. We're starting to run planning clinics as well, where people can bring their projects to an online forum, and there are people there who can give advice to help you solve particular problems.
Okay, so will we start there?
Hello. Okay. I just would like to ask you about your experience with about conservation of which species or which group of species is the most difficult to get the consensus on, if I'm clear. You know? I
think the more where you, I don't know if an answer would be, as the species becomes more charismatic, then the challenges of getting consensus increase. So it's, I think it's actually easier dealing with species such as snails in the Azores than dealing with Sumatran rhinos, or, you know, or mountain gorillas. We do work with all of those, and we do get plans produced, but I think you have people, it's linked to people's, partly linked to people's devotion to those species. Where you have species that have absorbed, where people have not had families, or they've ignored their families because they're just thinking about that species. They worked for 40 years with that species, dealing with malaria and dealing with all these other things that, you know, rebel groups and risking lives and things like that. Where you've got these people who are so wedded to the species, which is amazing. That's when you've got people, when you have a number of those sorts of people coming together, that becomes more challenging, just because they have very strong views. That is, they are the decisions around the species are perceived as being some decisions around their own validity as people. So when people become very close to the species, and you've got lots of people doing that, that's when complexity increases, because it is connected to how people see themselves, not just the species, but how people perceive themselves. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Hello.
Hi there.
You mentioned that it's quite much the conservation is far much to do with the people, you know, to discuss with them the things. And I have a question. Do you have some experience with people who are living not in the democratic states, you know, like in former times in Czech Republic, during the communism, there was no discussion, public discussion, and people are simply not open to discuss. They think something, but they don't express it. So it's very difficult to approach them, you know, and then this makes some consensus really difficult because you cannot even connect with them. You have some experience.
Yes, not
democratic.
Yes.
I mean, I don't know, some parties or whatever.
I think, yes, so we as a group do, and we have worked a certain amount in China and other places where there are more there are different approaches to how you manage and lead countries. And I think there is, I don't know whether there's, I mean, groups which, in situations where there is a lot of power sitting with a very few, they can be double-edged. In some ways, they can be very positive because if somebody decides that this is what's going to happen, and it's a good thing for the species, then good things can happen. Much easier than if you were trying to do it in Britain or the US or or where you guys are. But I think more of an issue or more of a challenge is thinking about the cultural differences in how people make decisions and the extent to which people feel comfortable, willing to see others equally. So even if you might say it as a ground rule that we need to view everyone has equal value in this room, if the culture is one that is very hierarchical, then you may need to think extra carefully about how you get people to actually say what they mean and be willing to and open to other people's perspectives who in everyday life they wouldn't need to listen to because they're the boss. So I think where you have hierarchies, strong hierarchies in place, and that's the cultural norm, then I think it becomes that bit more challenging. It's not impossible at all, it just becomes that bit more challenging.
Any more questions?
Hi. I would like to ask if you have always feedback from your conservation planning from the people who implement these things actually in the field. Maybe the feedback is positive or it's how it's working. You have this.
Yeah, so it doesn't always work, but we collect data from people straight after the workshops or in the workshops, so we get a sense of how did they find that it added more information? Do they feel as if they've developed their understanding of other people and other perspectives? Have they developed links with other groups? So we collect data from the workshops. We then also do reviews like Caroline did with that study that showed the impact on species. And then there's a book that's a good one to get, which is, it's not got a very nice title, but it's called Experiments in Consilience. And it's by a lady called Frances Wesley and a colleague of mine, Phil Miller. And it is a review of 20 or so projects where follow-up was done with the people from within those projects to look at what happened and how the process was designed, how effective it was or not, what was learned from it as well. What I think we need to do is still some work following up with individuals from within those projects, 5, 10, 15 years afterwards to say not just about the species and whether or not that's had been changed, but how has it influenced management decisions? How has it influenced culture within the projects? How has it influenced leadership? We know from some unpublished work that leadership is a big issue. Where you have poor leadership within projects, you have poor projects. But that's not surprising. But leadership is an important aspect to kind of get right. There's always more, though, that we could be collecting, and it's hugely complex. Obviously, there are lots of variables that could influence whether or not a project is successful, and the planning process is only one of those. But we're starting on that journey of collecting more data. If there are people who are interested in helping us on doing that, then I'm sure there are other questions we can answer as well.
More questions? Well, okay. Thank you so much, David. Lots to think about. It would be so nice to have you here in one of the central discussions. But
That'd be lovely.
Yeah,
absolutely. We'll stay in touch, and good luck with the rest of this this conference. And yeah, please do get in touch if you have any questions or comments. Then yeah, just drop me a line, and very happy to respond.
Fantastic.
All right. Keep on doing good conservation work. Put the species first. Put the species first. All right. Thank you very much. Cheers.